Good afternoon. My name is Mike Rost, and thank you for joining me on discussing the Mexican drug war conflict. I thought it'd be good to use conventional things such as who, what, when, where, why, and how to describe this conflict. And ultimately, we're going to end with whose fault this is. Is it America's fault, or is it Mexico's fault, or someone else's fault? So, who are the participants in this drug war? Well, certainly the drug cartels within Mexico and beyond Mexico, the end users in America that buy the product, the addicted, as well as those that just want to get high. You could argue that the U.S. government and its policies are a participant. You could argue that Mexico and its policies are a participant. To a lesser degree, perhaps, Colombia and its policies and government may be a participant. The drugs themselves are a participant. And bankers are a participant, as far as laundering all the cash. So what got me excited to explore this conflict? For me, I was trying to find something that I could get excited about. And what did it for me was the sheer number of deaths. I'll cover the specifics in just a moment. What else is involved? As I mentioned, drugs are involved. Guns from America and winding up in Mexico and vice versa are involved. And money. Money is a real driver. So the number of deaths. What got me excited was that the number of deaths, depending on which source you read, because journalism in Mexico is very dangerous. Many people get killed if they don't print what the drug cartels want them to print. And so it's hard to get exact facts. But what we do know is that it's at least 100,000 people that have been killed since 2006 when President Calderon declared a war on drugs. And it could be as high as 200,000. And that does not account for the 25 to 50,000 people that are reported as missing, as we just don't know what happened. Many of those are probably dead, but we just don't have the confirmations yet. And hopefully we don't get confirmations. Where does this conflict take place? Well, certainly much of it takes place in Mexico and the countries that it borders. The cocaine comes in from Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Many of the other drugs are made in Mexico and then distributed ultimately in the United States and elsewhere around the world. Much of the conflict, is where the cartels have a huge presence, and they're either buying people off and people are giving the cartels grief. The cartels don't put up with that. There's certainly conflict in many of the border towns, as people don't want drugs crossing through their town. So there's some vigilantes. Some of this drug war actually takes place in the United States because there's revenge hits. There's people tied to the cartels to the streets pushing these drugs. So this war, this conflict, is taking place in at least a couple countries and probably at least 3 countries. So why? Money, money, money. Analysts have said that it ranges from $50 to $65 billion as far as the revenues that the illicit drug trade creates annually. And the profits, are probably 10 to 20 billion per year. It's very hard to get exact statistics because it's a cash business and cartels are not in the business of sharing their trade secrets and their exact costs to do business. Unfortunately, their costs to do business have often been innocent and civilian deaths. How does this happen? There's Mexico and the United States, the borders there, it spans 6 Mexican states and 4 U.S. states. It has over 20 commercial railroad crossings. There's 45 Mexico-U.S. crossings with 330 ports of entry. So that's largely how the drugs get through. And if we had a wall, very little would change. You could argue that people may not get through, illegal people, but the drugs are hidden in cargo containers, passenger vehicles, and until they get more sophisticated ways of discovering the drugs, they're going to get through. And even if you have the sophisticated weapons to stop it, the technologies and things, the dogs that can sniff it, people get paid off. Dogs get killed. So there are many barriers to stopping the flow of drugs into the United States. Some would say it's America's fault, and we'll start there. First off, Trump's own administration, the former Secretary of State said basically we have to own up for our responsibility of the massive drug problem in the United States. He wasn't so much pointing fingers, he was pointing the forefingers back at us saying, hey, it's our problem. We need to own this. The United States has had a failed war on drugs by most people's account for the last 40 years, since 1973, more than 40 years actually, since Richard Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Agency. The United States, and here's a key point, it's failed to regulate this $65 billion market for illicit drugs. So we've tried to do this through crime and penalties and asset forfeiture, and that hasn't worked. And now we're starting to experiment with rehab and education and those kinds of things in lieu of jail time. And the results haven't been around long enough to know if that's really going to work. But America's drug policy is incoherent. The feds say marijuana is illegal. Some states say yes and thumb their nose at federal policy. We have an opioid crisis. We're talking about prescribing less or smaller prescriptions, and then people resort to the street if they're already addicted or need that substance, and the pharmacy won't give it to them. They'll go to somebody that will if they're addicted. They'll steal and kill to get it. So the United States has also pressured its allies to go ahead and be equally tough on crime and to extradite drug kingpins over to America for prosecution. We're one of the few countries that demands that. So overall, there may not be a ton of factors, but the factors for America being at fault are huge. Now, there are those that say America's not at fault. Who could argue that the corruption and culture of Mexico has been that way for decades? It was a one-party rule until 2000 when Vicente Fox was elected. And when President Calderon was elected in 2006, he was very marginally elected, very weak, didn't have a mandate. So he wanted to show he was the new sheriff in town, so he declared a war on drugs. That's been an abysmal failure. You could argue it's Mexico's fault. Deaths went up since before this war on drugs from 8 per 100,000 to peaking at 24 per 100,000 and stabilizing at more than twice what it was before he did at 16 per 100,000. Mexico has not reined in its judges, its mayors, its police, and at some level the cartels control those functions, or they bribe those functions, or they hold those functions as hostage to getting what they want. So they don't have the strength to get it done. They don't have a clear sign of what victory would look like. So Mexico clearly could be the one really at fault. America's given Mexico more than $2 billion in the last decade through Operation Moreta to go ahead and train them and to help stem the flow of drugs, right? So we've actually given them money, significant monies, and unfortunately much of it's not been used as intended. There's all kinds of stories that it never really got to the places it should have gotten. We could certainly point fingers that the United Nations hasn't done its bit. The United Nations doesn't deal with intra-country conflicts, but this is a multiple country conflict, and the United Nations has basically been clueless. They've basically been a debating club, and not a very good one. The drug trafficking organizations, they're the ones that either import the drugs from Colombia or make the drugs, such as heroin, methamphetamines, until recently marijuana, cocaine, and they also are a big supplier and creator of the easier to smuggle fentanyl, which kind of gives opium an acceleration. So we've talked about the power of the drug cartels, the borders, and we talked about the poor strategy. So in conclusion, we can't really say definitively it's one side or the other. That's for you, the viewer, to decide. I've tried to present why America's at fault, and I've tried to present basically why Mexico's at fault. And each of these, it's not as clear as just a single country. But in any event, I appreciate you watching this video and learning more about this important conflict. Thank you very much.